Hello and welcome. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers50. Every year, Thinkers50 inducts new management thinkers into its Hall of Fame, which is supported by our partners at the Hire Group. The Hall of Fame recognizes and celebrates thinkers who have made a significant long-term contribution to management thinking and practice. This year's inductees into the Hall of Fame are a stellar group, and it is a pleasure to recognize their contribution. My guest today is one of those inductees, Gary Hamel. Gary is someone who has been featured on the Thinkers50 ranking since it first started more than 20 years ago. He's been on the faculty of London Business School for more than 30 years and is the director of the Management Lab. He's written 20 articles for the Harvard Business Review and is the most reprinted author in the review's history. Gary's books have been translated into more than 25 languages. His most recent bestsellers are Humanocracy with Michele Zanini, which came out in 2020, What Matters Now came out in 2012, The Future of Management in 2007, and Leading the Revolution in 2000. In these volumes, Gary presents an impassioned plea for reinventing management and lays out a practical blueprint for building organizations that are fit for the future. In his influential early work, Gary collaborated with CK Prahalad. Their book, Competing for the Future, came out in 1994 and was one of the most important books of the 1990s. Included groundbreaking concepts such as strategic intent, core competence, industry revolution, and management innovation. So Gary has really changed the language and practice of management in organizations around the globe. Gary, welcome. And congratulations on becoming a member of the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame. Looking back over your stellar career, how do you make sense of it? What's the golden thread that runs through it? Or is there one?
I think there are a couple of threads, perhaps, Stuart, although, you don't really see the thread when you're in the midst of it and you're just working and thinking. But I suppose, one of the threads really traces back to my experience when I was a PhD student in the University of Michigan back in the late 1970s. And that was the first time that US industry and probably Western industry had really been challenged by global competition, particularly from Japan at that time. And living in Michigan with the US auto industry, I saw them kind of miss the future. I saw the arrogance, the kind of inward looking that allowed them to simply write off, dismiss this new competitive threat. And particularly, I saw the cost of that management failure in terms of families who lost their homes, their living, and it hit me. Two things hit me very early on there. One was that competition has real human consequences. That, even though I might have been looking at this through a more theoretical lens at the time as a young PhD student, this had a huge impact on people's lives. And number two, that when things go wrong, it's usually not the fault of those on the front lines, but the myopia and so on is usually a fault of those at the top. So I think that sense of the human consequences of how our organizations are run and where the real responsibility lies, those have been threads throughout all of my work.
What got you interested in businesses and organizations in the first place?
That's a hard thing for me to kind of go back and remember, I suppose. I mean, clearly I had this sense, as a young kid, is that business was a hugely important part of society. I grew up, my father was a professor of music and the dean of a music school. So I grew up in a very kind of liberal arts environment, but I could see that so much of the world was shaped by organizations and by businesses. And it just intrigued me from a young age. What made them run? How do they decide where to go next? How to set their strategy? And so I decided quite early on, got an MBA, then went and got a PhD, that was really what I was focused on. And I have to say, I've never been disappointed by that choice. It's a topic that's just endlessly rich and fascinating. And these institutions more than ever have a huge impact over every aspects of our life. What we see in media, how we shop, how we think. So, I think they are today for sure the most important institutions in society in terms of their impact on human lives.
What about CK? Can you tell us what was it like when you first met CK? He was quite an intimidating person because he was quite physically intimidating and intellectually intimidating for a young PhD student. He must.
Well, we actually arrived at the University of Michigan, I think the same year. He came as a new faculty member. He wasn't in my area. He was in I was in international business. He was in strategy. But I do remember the first kind of real conversation we had. He was presenting some of his doctoral work around multinational corporations, and I took issue with a particular aspect of that, which I remember, but I won't bore people and go into this. But we had, almost a knockdown fight. Voices were raised. We were very animated. The people around us were sure that we would never speak to each other again. And at the end of that meeting, we got together and said, like, wow, that was a really interesting conversation. I appreciated his perspectives. He appreciated mine. So although I never took a class from him, we started working together while I was still at the University of Michigan. And that was a partnership that lasted about 20 years or more. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot from CK. I think probably the most important thing was never to take anything for granted. What CK would always kind of ask in any setting, maybe ask himself internally, but sometimes ask those around, like, what aren't we seeing here? What assumptions are we making that we really haven't examined? Is there another way of thinking about this? So just instinctively, he was a contrarian and was much more interested in doing something original than building on something else. In fact, I did get one piece of advice I got from him when I was doing my thesis. He said, Gary, do the literature review last of all. He said, if you start by reading what everybody else has written and kind of building on that, you will, by definition, do something that's derivative. So start by thinking about the own problem. What do you want to solve? What are you interested in? Work on that really hard, then come back and fit that back into what anybody else has said. Now, that's kind of a high risk strategy for a young PhD student, because you might discover something somebody has already looked at, but boy, that was good advice. And I've tried to practice that in my career, ever since. Look where other people aren't looking, ask the questions they aren't asking, challenge the assumptions they take for granted. And I think, one of the ways I've internalized that, Stuart, over the years is, today in our world, it's almost impossible to know more. There's so much information out there. It's so accessible. Anybody can go and acquire it. So the real value as an individual is almost never knowing more, but it's knowing different. It's looking at problems from a new perspective. And certainly I saw that modeled in CK's work.
And looking back, competing for the future, which actually we've used it in our classes about how to write, because it's actually really well, I've always thought, a really well written book, very, very coherent and persuasive all the way through, which is unusual in a business book. How do you think it stands up? Looking back, how do you think the ideas, have they stood the test of time?
I'd like to think so. I'll let other people being the judge. But I think there were a couple of ideas there. I mean, I don't really remember that book very much. It's a long time ago. So in the details, you don't ask me about that. But I think some of the broad themes definitely hold up. One of those is that you really have to think from the future back. Right? We can so much get caught up in existing industry structures, markets, what customers want, that we really don't think about how the world's changing. We don't play out those trends. We don't think about, we don't really look at the world around us from that kind of future back perspective. And I think, many companies fall prey to that. They look at the future through the lens of what is, and everything they do is an extrapolation of what they're already doing. And by definition, you'll never really create the future if that's the way you think. So I think that idea stands up. I think the second idea is that no organization really outperforms its aspirations. So that was the idea of strategic intent. It was the idea of setting a very ambitious goal and then trying to understand how you might reach that. And certainly at the time, the kind of more planning approach, more incremental approach, really asked, only commit to what you can plan for, right? What you can actually program out for the next few years. Well, by definition, you can't plan for greatness. You can't plan to kind of disrupt an industry. So that sense of setting a bigger aspiration, working back, and of course, what we discovered through our work is that innovation is almost always born in the gap between aspiration and resources. And it's only when you set a very stretching aspiration, it forces you to think quite differently and more creatively about what you're doing. So I think that idea is held up. I think another idea in the book, the idea of core competence, and really asking yourself as an organization, where are we going to build deep world-class skills? What kind of knowledge are we building that's complex, that makes a big contribution to customer value? And that idea, I think, has stood up for sure. You look at some of the companies that we admire right now. Apple, over the last decade, has built an entirely new competence around designing systems on a chip, immensely complex semiconductors, processors, which are now inside of every product that Apple makes. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. I mean, they were always celebrated for their sense of design, but that's much easier to replicate than this very deep, complicated capability to create chips with billions of transistors. Or you look at Tesla and the capabilities they're building around battery technology, AI, autonomous driving. So I think, yeah, now more than ever, if you want to survive, if you want to grow as a business, you really need to ask, where are we building world-class skills, which are very difficult to replicate, which will allow us to move in new directions and will be highly valued in the products and services by customers. So I think some of the big ideas have held up. Obviously, as an author, any particular example you choose will probably be made irrelevant by time. It's very hard to pick one organization out and say, well, this is the way to do it. So I wouldn't want to go back and look at all those companies we might have talked about. Who knows how they all turned out? But I think the underlying ideas have held up.
So when did you realize that the ideas in competing for the future and the HBR articles you did with CK, when did you realize that they were really connecting with people? Was there kind of an ignition point?
I think it's when companies started calling us, when Ford and Motorola and Philips and Shell and others said, this seems to be really important to us, and was fresh thinking. So, for me, Stuart, the test of an idea has always been, does it resonate with practitioners? That was another kind of risky thing to do. Although I went through the traditional tenure process, I had Michael Porter on my tenure committee, among others, and that's a fairly daunting prospect, but got through that. But I never really was very much interested in writing maximum number of pages for journals read by minimum number of people. And the same was true for CK. And I think, very early in my career at the London Business School, in a way, I don't think what happened today, by the time, I'd been there a year or two, and they started putting me in front of executive audiences. And these were people, who are probably 20 years older than me than average. I had only worked for 1 year in a real organization before I became an academic. And that experience early on of working with practitioners, sitting late in the bar, listening to their questions, what was on their mind, you develop a deep empathy for what it's like to be a leader in an organization, but also a deep understanding of the issues they're up against. So that was always that was always the audience we were writing for. And if academics found it interesting, well, that was great too. But that's really what started to, I think, in a way, validate the work we were doing. Was a lot of leaders and a lot of organizations around the world said, this is important for us to think about.
So what do you think of it as your core competencies? Because I think you were getting at that, between the distinction between being a kind of dyed-in-the-wool academic, being a consultant, or a teacher of executive education. So what do you see as what are you bringing to the party, do you think?
A tough question. What I would say, and other people have to judge the extent to which I live out some of these principles and capabilities or not, Stuart. But I think one of the questions that always has intrigued me is, how do you make a difference as an individual? Each of us only has so many hours in the day, so many people we can influence. And so what really determines the breadth and significance of the impact you can have on the world around you? And there are 4 things that have kind of been touch points for me through my career. One of them I already mentioned, which is trying to learn to think differently. And you can develop that as a conscious habit of asking, what are people assuming? What are we not talking about? But it also means, for me, doing most of my reading outside of business. the kind of dominant paradigm we have of thinking about businesses and particularly about organizations, all based on a bureaucratic model that's about 150 years old. Power trickles down, big leaders appoint little leaders, people compete for the scarce resource of promotion, powerful staff groups set the rules and demand compliance. I mean, basically everything we know about organizations, we learn by looking at organizations that fit that template. And so, almost any management or business book that is written takes all of that for granted, without even being explicit about it. So I've certainly read a lot more in philosophy, in biology, in economics, in psychology, in neuroscience than I have in management through my career, because I think that's what allows you perhaps to bring some new thinking into what can be a fairly stale and kind of incestuous field. I think the second thing is just having courage. And it's having the willingness to tackle really, really difficult challenges for which there's no obvious answer. And so I was always interested in big problems, big questions. Early on, the questions that intrigued me is, where do rule-breaking strategies come from? And later it was, well, how does a company change its strategy, its very identity, when it's kind of become irrelevant, or that strategy is reaching its sell-by date? So if you tackle a big problem rather than something incremental, simply building on what somebody else has already done, it forces you to be curious. It forces you to stretch yourself, and it also kind of keeps you intellectually alive. So I think contrarian for sure, a certain amount of courage. I think third, we've also touched a little bit on this. It's also compassion. I think we live in a very, very cynical world where, almost the moment you open your mouth, other people are thinking, well, what's in it for him? How is he trying to defend his position? What's his corner? And I think when people start to see that what you really care about is how do you make their lives better? How do you make their organizations better when it's about them and not you? Then people are willing to take risks with you and try things and do things that I think they otherwise wouldn't. So I think compassion is a huge multiplier of impact. And I guess the last thing for me is community, is reaching out and trying to enroll others, get others to be part of whatever you're doing. We created this thing a few years ago called the Management Innovation Exchange, and we've now gone on to other things. But, we had 40,000 managers together around the world sharing their ideas about what's changing and how our organizations need to evolve. And I've always believed that's also a big multiplier, right? It's not about you sitting in your ivory tower in your corner, but it's your ability to influence, engage, and harness the wisdom of others. So, I don't know how good I've done on those things in terms of courage, compassion, contrarian thinking, and trying to build community, but certainly that's what I aspire to.
And who have been the other key mentors in your career? CK early on. I'm thinking of people at London Business School you must have worked with, like Charles Handy or Samantha Ghoshal. Who are the other key?
I had a lot of respect for all of those individuals. I had a lot of wonderful conversations with Charles Handy through the years. Samantha Ghoshal, we disagreed on some pretty fundamental things, but he was also somebody who could bridge that gap between academia and the managerial world. He was also interested in really, the deepest core assumptions we had about business and organizations. So with all of those people, they were all, colleagues that I deeply respected, that we had amazingly deep and interesting conversations with. And I learned from all of those individuals. I would say most of my mentors in a way have been managers. They're people I've worked with who have taught me about how organizations really work and what they're really up against. And that would be Bob Galvin when he was running Motorola. It would be some of the people at Ford Motor Company when I worked with them many, many years ago. And, and leaders, too numerous to count. More recently, people like Angela Ahrendts when she was running all of retail at Apple, and before that, Burberry. Mark King, who ran Autodos in North America, and now Taco Bell. I've had the good fortune to meet hundreds and hundreds of leaders, and to be able to really start to understand how rare and how extraordinary good leadership is. And some of those people I've been able to work with, and that's always been, that's the best part of what I do.
Have you ever been tempted to take on an executive position?
Not really. I was offered, I won't tell you the company, but when I was very early in my career, I was offered a salary of $1 million a year to become the head of strategy for a large global company. And I thought about it for, maybe 30 seconds. But early in my career, as I mentioned, my first job after I got my MBA was as a hospital administrator. And I barely lasted a year. You're sitting in the same committee meetings week after week, talking about the same things. I just did not find it intellectually interesting enough, to be honest. And I knew that, like, the wonderful thing, Stuart, about being an academic is the closest you can be to being an anarchist and still get a salary. You don't really report to anybody. You report to your students who can be very demanding judges of your performance, but you really get to work on what's ever interesting to you. You don't really have a boss. Nobody's keeping track of when you show up. So it was a perfect career for somebody at heart who's, ironically enough, would struggle in any large organization.
I think that's the case with so many people in this business thinking world. I always get a sense of frustration in your work that practice lags so far behind some of the groundbreaking organizations you have celebrated over recent years, like companies like Hire, Nucor, WL Gore, Morningstar, Buurtzorg. I mean, you really celebrate what they're doing. They're a really fantastic, innovative organization. But there is a sense of frustration I get that they're not emulated so widely.
I think the frustration comes in different varieties and for different reasons, Stuart. If you are looking forward and you're trying to imagine how organizations could be fundamentally better than they are, by definition, you're going to be frustrated. And I think it's a healthy kind of frustration, right? Contentment does not create progress, right? A kind of healthy discontent. And sometimes that discontent is not, about one organization that's figured out and why doesn't everybody else see it? It's just about why do most organizations suck in a particular way? And then you go looking for some that may not. But, progress is driven by that kind of discontent. And I've sometimes argued that both managers, and often I have to say my academic colleagues, suffer from a kind of ambition deficit disorder, ADD. And the sense is, however good, pick your company du jour, whether it's Hire or 10 years ago, it might have been Google or somebody else, pick your exemplar du jour. There's a tendency always to say, well, as good as they're doing it, that's as good as it can be. So, like, go thou and do likewise. And if that's really, if all you're trying to do is accelerate the diffusion of management practices from the bleeding edge to everybody else, you're basically a journalist, right? Not anything against journalists, but you're just kind of writing cases and telling stories. And so I think it's important to have your own point of view about what organizations could become that's independent of what any particular exemplar at the moment. And, that's a little dangerous, position to be in, because you may be aspiring to something that's actually impossible. I remember many years ago in my office here in California talking to the esteemed Jim March, one of the greatest organizational theorists, of the 20th century, a longtime faculty member at Harvard, and at Stanford. I think he just retired. And I remember Stuart asking him, do you believe we could ever change the fundamental nature of large organizations? What I said, they tend to be insular, conservative, risk averse, dehumanizing, slow. And he thought about that for a while and he said, no. And, I refuse to accept that, right? I think, again, he has spent all of his life inside organizations that fit a particular model, and within that model, there were absolute limits on what you can do. It's like asking somebody, will a combustion engine ever be pollution free? Well, like, no, and they'd be right in that. So, but that didn't stop me from aspiring and saying, why can't our organizations be fundamentally more resilient than they are? I wrote an article, 15 years ago or more, The Quest for Resilience, which kind of predated all the thinking now about agility. Why can't we make innovation literally a core competence? Why can't it be everybody's job every day rather than something that happens in R&D, product development, and incubator somewhere? Why can't every job be infused with dignity and opportunity and equity rather than disheartening and dispiriting and so on. And so I think you have to be willing to look beyond the status quo and what is, and try to imagine what could be. One of the analogies I use often today with leaders is I ask them, can you imagine an organization that is as different from, the bureaucratic status quo we have right now? Can you imagine something that is as different as PayPal is from a checkbook, or as YouTube is, from the BBC? And many, many leaders struggle with that question, right? They've all grown up in and around organizations that fit the same model. And it's just like, actually, I don't think I could. And so I think, the first response, if somehow you are in this category of management thinker, whatever that means, I think your first responsibility is to stretch people's thinking and to get them to imagine what could be. And sometimes you'll get that wrong and maybe ask people to do impossible things. But the alternative is, we just kind of keep incrementing forward like a degree at a time. The other thing I would say, Stuart, on that point, that was hugely important in my work and my thinking, I started reading military history and looking at how innovation has happened in military structures going back 800 years. And what you learn when you look at that is armies and navies, like the British Navy, that enjoyed long periods of superiority for a long time, that was not a question of tactics. It wasn't a question of strategy or even technology, but it was a question of organization. That they developed fundamentally new ways of thinking about how you use human beings and how you extend their capabilities, whether that was the Prussian army inventing the staff system and the meritocratic selection of officers, whether it was the British Army inventing the regimental system and so on. And then when I started looking at companies back through the 20th century, like GE and Toyota and others, you saw the same thing. It wasn't about products and technology. It wasn't even about individual leaders, but it was about inventing new forms of management, new forms of organization that multiplied human capability. So that got me really thinking about management innovation. I spent a lot of time thinking about strategy innovation, but thinking about management innovation as something that was really deeply neglected in most organizations, but very, very important. But I would have never kind of understood that probably if I'd merely been looking at existing organizations, what they were doing. It took a much deeper look outside the world of business to kind of at least trigger that in my head.
Yeah, you're working on management innovation. I mean, you did stuff with Julian Birkinshaw from London Business School, the Management Innovation Lab, and identified management innovation as a kind of unheralded form of competitive advantage. And it seems to me that in your work, you're saying that management is really underestimated as a force for good and as a force within organizations.
Yeah, and Stuart, I know you and everyone at the Thinkers50 has had, you've understood this for a long time. Hence, what you've been doing there, trying to celebrate the ideas that are changing the world of management. But, I wrote that piece, I don't know when it was. I want to say maybe 2000, who knows when it was, a long time ago for Harvard Business Review, called The What, How, and Why of Management Innovation, something like that. And that came out of that work that I'd been doing, going back into military history. But yes, if you look over the last 150 years or so, and this extraordinary rise in labor productivity and capital productivity, right? I mean, which has driven prosperity now for the last century and a half. Typically we tell that story in terms of technology, right? The combustion engine, the light bulb, the computer chip, and the internet, and contraceptives and synthetic materials and so on. But of course, none of those scientific inventions would have ever made a difference in our lives if we couldn't produce them at scale and make them affordable. And that was management. That was Henry Ford figuring out, how do you run, at the time, the largest, most integrated manufacturing facility in the world. It was people at DuPont and capital budgeting. How do we make sure we put our money behind the best projects? It was General Motors thinking about how to run a very complex multi-brand organization in a kind of intelligent way. It was folks at Toyota thinking about how do you turn every employee into a problem solver. And yet in public policy and certainly economists, they look at the firm as a black box. They don't really focus attention on that. And certainly my argument today is if you look at the last 20 or 30 years of declining productivity growth across the West and in China now too, falling even faster, with huge implications for our ability to fund our priorities and environment and social programs, greater income inequality. If you look at the consequences of that steadily declining productivity growth, they're very, very dire. This is like the number one problem economists worry about today. And I would argue a lot of that is because, management is kind of is just reached a point of maturity. It's way out on the S curve, like the combustion engine. Almost all of the innovation in my lifetime in management has been very, very incremental, including things like agile teams. And I would argue we need to get management onto a new S curve. We have to go back to the fundamental assumptions we have and challenge those, just like now we're trying to move into EVs and so on. We need the same kind of fresh thinking in management. And, economists like Robert Gordon and others who've looked at this kind of productivity problem, they reach the same conclusion, not so much about management, but we just have a declining pace of fundamental innovation. And most of the new patents are for relatively small innovations. But again, if you go back through history, the most important general purpose technology of all, it wasn't electricity or computing, it was management, our ability to bring people together and do collectively what we couldn't do individually. And I think, we're just at the end of that bureaucratic model, and we have to find something better. That's been the focus of my work more recently. And so I would come back and make this important distinction. You talked about the importance of management, and I believe that. But I think of management not as a group of people called managers. Management is just our ability as a species to organize and mobilize ourselves, around important problems. So however we get it done, there's always going to be planning and resource allocation, organizing and motivating and coordinating and controlling. All of those things will exist forever. My belief is that in a decade or so's time, our organizations will be very different. The most successful ones will be very different. And most of that work of managing will be done without a lot of managers.
I think in many instances, it's something you've drawn attention to, is managers are labeled leaders and expected to behave differently simply because of that, even though they're still managing rather than leading. And the distinction between management and leadership, leadership has perennially been the sexy twin, hasn't it, of management?
Yeah, I think what happened, and in fact, I've looked at this, I'm pretty sure what happened is, if you look at management as a discipline, and now it's kind of hard to realize this without a historical perspective, Stuart. But if you go back into the late 19th century, when we started to build large-scale organizations, and a bit earlier than that in the UK, and then later in the United States, and then in Germany. So suddenly we had plants that had 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people, and we literally did not know how to manage that many people. And it's important to remember that those people were mostly illiterate, not poorly educated. They were illiterate. And so we created this new kind of job called the manager, who was supposed to exercise control, make sure people showed up on time, measure their performance, dole out rewards. And back in the late 19th, early 20th century, being a manager was today like being a data scientist or a geneticist. It was quite a rare skill, not very well understood, kind of, very much admired. The first business schools get established by this time, Wharton, 1890 something, Harvard, I think, in the 1920s. And so universities came in to fill this demand for this new skill set called being a manager. And companies that had better managers than others had a big advantage. GE established Crotonville, and they were the first company to establish an internal kind of management university. They understood the importance of general management. Well, you fast forward that up to maybe the 1980s and so on, early 1990s. Management had become a commodity. We kind of knew what it took to be a good manager. We could select for that. We could train for people for that. If you look at Peter Drucker's work, almost all of it was around management. In fact, I think was it the book, The Effective Executive, one of his best-selling books. I looked at this. It uses the word manager more than 200 times, and it uses the word leader or leadership 11 times. So I think what happened among business schools, consulting companies, and so on in as I say, the late 80s, early 90s, is we started to realize we were selling a commodity product. that there was nothing anymore very glamorous, or even you didn't create much competitive advantage simply by having better managers, at least not in a first-rate company. And so we started to talk about leadership. Not that we understood it, not that we knew how to train people to be leaders, but we kind of gave every manager a battlefield upgrade and, battlefield promotion, and said, now you're a leader. Wouldn't you like to be a leader? And, if you listen to people like Jeff Pfeffer at Stanford and Barbara Kellerman at Harvard, they will tell you we still know almost nothing about how to train leaders. And in fact, this huge industry we call leadership development, depending on how you count it, maybe $20-30 billion a year around the world. There's literally no evidence what we're getting for all that money. And I'll just give one little interesting data point I came across. So typically there's only a couple of academic papers a year that measure the effectiveness of leadership development programs. There's not a lot of data here and research done. Virtually all of those papers that look at the effectiveness of leadership development, they measure it in terms of how happy people were at the end of the program. Not did it change their behavior, not did it make their organizations better. Like, was this a good experience? Was this a good time for you? And I would argue that's a very poor way of measuring. If I was measuring, I would ask the subordinates, come back a year later and say, did anything change when we sent your leader off to wherever school for whatever program? So yeah, I think more and more you have to think about leadership. For me, my definition of leadership is somebody who makes a catalytic contribution to collective accomplishment in difficult circumstances and with limited resources. And that can be anybody at any level in any organization, but certainly genuine leadership does not correlate with hierarchy. And there's almost nothing in most organizations. If you look at promotion, who gets ahead, there's almost nothing in there that is really selecting for people who are great leaders. They're selecting for people who know how to manage the status quo and not screw it up. They're selecting for people who know how to manage up and keep the boss happy. It's selecting for people who are very good at negotiating targets, not leadership. So, that's another area, hopefully the next generation of scholars is going to really dig into that and say, is there something we really can do to grow leaders? But changing definitions and still teaching them basically administrative skills, which is what happens in most of these leadership programs, I don't think that we just know that doesn't make much of a difference.
I think Crotonville's up for sale, isn't it? Which I wonder what that says.
Yes, I would imagine it would be. And, so all those administrative skills will always be important. But again, and by the way, when we talk about leaders and you say we need people who are more authentic, I agree with that. We need people who are more selfless. Absolutely. We need people who really act as servant leaders. Yes, we do. We need people who can look over the horizon. For sure we do. But again, I don't think there's much in leadership training that really develops that capability. That's not something that happens in a week or two or three at some business school. That would be a process of having people around you who mentor you over months and months and years. It starts with a really deep personal commitment to personal transformation. And certainly the curriculum, the tools we're using right now to develop leaders don't go deep enough. We don't give people enough time. So as you can tell, even though I've spent a lot of my life doing that, I'm pretty skeptical about the difference that leadership development makes. So.
How do you find the organizations that you champion and highlight? How do you discover them? And when you go to visit them, what kind of antennae do you need to think, oh yeah, they're doing something really different?
Most of them discover me because they see things I'm writing and they go, my experience with Hire and Hire very well, Stuart, and Zhang Rumen, now they're chairman emeritus, who has built one of the most radically managed companies in the world. My experience with that goes back about 12 years. I think I got this email from Hire. I'd never heard of them before in China, and they said, we're coming to Silicon Valley. Can we meet with you? And we sat around my conference table in my office with translators, and I literally could hardly understand. I don't mean the language. I mean in terms of what they were saying. Like, they clearly had this view of building an organization that was unlike any other. And I think the reason Zhang Ruimin had came, he said, I'd written this book called The Future of Management, in which I'd argued that our organizations needed to be much more like networks and less like hierarchies. And I could see how technology was going to make that possible. They become much more lateral and much less vertical. And I remember him asking me, saying, Gary, I found that interesting. Has any organization done that? I said, not to my knowledge. He said, we're going to go do it. And, I think in many respects they have. Similarly, I'm doing research right now. I can't tell you the company, but with one of the world's biggest drug companies. And in a part of that drug company, they've taken out, and this is a highly regulated industry, they've taken out half the level of managers. They've gone from 150 job descriptions to 4. There is no more traditional promotion, but your salary increases depend on peer-reviewed impact. I mean, they've completely blown up the bureaucratic model in a part of their business, which is immensely regulated. And so they come and find me and say, Gary, we think you'd be interested in this. And usually I am. So, the companies that are really doing this, they want to talk about it and they want to have a dialogue. And so Gore, that's how I learned about Gore and Hire and so on. So, yeah.
Isn't it amazing that, 30 years ago, if you had thought you'd be taking management inspiration from a Chinese company, you would have dismissed that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I sometimes say to Western executives, I said, like, the good news is I've seen the future management. The bad news, perhaps for you, is that it's in China. Now, I think the Hire model will be as hard to spread in China as anywhere else. Even though many people in China are following it, it's not an easy thing to do. Not because what they've done is so opaque or technically difficult, but the reason, I think, Stuart, the primary reason we're still stuck with organizations that look more or less like the ones 50 or 100 years ago is, our organizations are caste systems. And they work far better for the few than the many. Power is concentrated at the top. There's kind of this implicit perspective that the leaders are here, the thinkers are here, the doers are down below. And if you've spent a career, building and accumulating bureaucratic power and all the perks and compensation that goes with that, somebody comes to you and says, like, well, we need to go to an organization that maybe has 1 or 2 layers. As you know, when Hire made this shift, they essentially got rid of 11,000 middle manager positions. And most of those people weren't fired. They went to work at these small micro enterprises that they had established, more than 4,000, these little almost independent business units tied together through technology. But again, if you're an EVP or you're the head of a big staff group, that's not, that's a very, that's a very challenging thing to do. And so, if you go back through history, and this is another kind of piece of learning, one of the questions I'd asked is, so if bureaucracy is one of the most deeply embedded, socially ubiquitous, systems there, what do we know about how these things change? How did aristocracy change? How did we come to view slavery as iniquitous, right? How did we start to challenge the assumptions of patriarchy? And you go back and you look at how we've changed these big, deeply embedded social systems, again, which all of them squandered vast quantities of human capacity, like our organizations do. All of them worked better for the few than the many. You go back and you look at that, Stuart, and what you find is none of them changed because of a utilitarian argument. They didn't change, aristocracy didn't disappear because somebody said we need to unleash the energy of the merchant class, right? Slavery didn't change because somebody said we don't need slaves because now we have mechanization and so on. Patriarchy didn't change because people said, why are we wasting all this female talent? They changed when people said it's wrong. And when they said, the right of every individual to grow and use their human gifts is fundamental, and anything we place in the way of that is wrong. And I think that's how ultimately we will come to the conclusion that we need a different organizational model, right? The fact that only 20% of employees are engaged in their work around the world, the fact that right now, this is current research, only 25% of managers in European enterprises see frontline employees as important to competitive advantage. The fact that only 1 out of 11 employees are able to experiment in their jobs and their work, right? This is all an artifact of 150 years ago, as I say, when most employees were ignorant, when information was expensive to move, when management was a rare skill. And so again, when you go back through history, you learn that it takes a new moral argument to change things and a new moral conviction to change things. You also learn that there's often a very long lag between technological innovation and organizational innovation. So when you look at the entry, for example, if you look at the entry of the musket into European warfare, which required a very different way of organizing military units in the field, it took 100 years for that organization to change. It should have been obvious instantly. And the people who looked at it said, well, it took so long because you had to have several generals, generations of generals die off before this change could actually happen. So I think where we're at today, technology is going to completely change the way our organizations work. You look at Hire, how they're using smart contracting, blockchain to allow units to contract with each other, basically taking the technology of Internet of Things and applying that internally within their own organization. You look at a company like Birdzorg, which has a proprietary technology platform that lets 16,000 caregivers communicate and learn from each other and level up with virtually no managers at all. So right now, companies are using these technologies like Slack and Microsoft Teams. They're basically using them as little adjuncts to the old bureaucratic model. Like, let's make our white collar teams a little bit more productive. But they haven't yet really played through the implications of where this really leads, which is going to be something far more radical. But that's the way it always is, right? We invent the new technology and then it takes quite a while to really, understand how that could change the way we organize ourselves as human beings. And, the lags are there mostly because of political reasons, not because, technically it's so difficult to figure out a different way of managing or leading.
I think Tom Peters said that middle managers are cooked geese, and that was in his 1992 book, Liberation Management.
Yeah, it's interesting. I may end up being in the same category of kind of predicting the demise here, and then it not happening. Peter Drucker, I think he was writing in 1988 because he could see these things. He could see a much better educated workforce, information. Everybody can have a view of the whole firm and what's going on, and it's information that allows us to be self-managing. Without it, we're kind of helpless. So he could see these same trends, and he predicted that we'd have half the number of layers and a third the number of managers now that we have. And that's not the case. We have, the bureaucratic class has grown much, managers, administrators, that's growing much faster than the working population as a whole. The average global 1,000 company still has 8 or 9 management levels in it. So, Peter Drucker was wrong. Tom Peters was wrong. I may be wrong. Having said that, I may just be lucky enough to be to be at the point where this is finally going to become inevitable, and we'll see. But I think there are enough organizations now that understand this, that are moving in this direction, and some very notable large companies. We were talking to Brian Moynihan, the chief executive chairman of Bank of America. Over the last few years, they've taken out half the levels of management in Bank of America. That's pretty incredible. This drug company I mentioned, the CEO of the company, for the last 5 years, they've spent 1 day a week, he and all of his direct reports, just looking at how do we dismantle bureaucracy, because they understand that that bureaucratic system is unaffordable, and particularly in healthcare, where healthcare is bankrupting countries. And so if you say, I want to deliver 3x the healthcare at half the cost, you can't do it with those old structures, and they recognize that. So we'll see. I'm ever optimistic, but we'll see.
So what's next, Gary? Humanocracy came out in 2020. Another book in the pipeline?
Could be. I don't know. I'm kind of, Stuart, I'm kind of thinking that, a book is kind of an interesting thing to do, but I'm not sure it gives you enough leverage. So we're thinking about a few other things, and I'll just give a small hint. It's been very interesting to watch how the world has mobilized around climate change. Not fast enough, we're not doing enough, but clearly we have a global consensus around that. We're starting to set targets. Companies and organizations are taking that seriously. Companies report on their environmental impact. And I've been thinking, how do you bring that same energy around debureaucratizing our organization? So we're trying to decarbonize the global economy. But when I look at the problems we're facing as a species, whether it's climate change, whether it's pandemics, income inequality, refugees, access to healthcare, education, these problems are multi-jurisdictional. They're immensely complex. They're culturally embedded. There's simply no way we solve those problems with organizations that are arrogant, top-down, rule-driven. Like it's literally impossible. I was talking the other day to 50 CEOs of the leading NGOs and charities around the world. They understand this down on the ground. So I think, apart from reasons of competitive, advantage, just solving the sorts of problems that are in front of us as a species are going to require organizations that look very, very, very different, experimenting much more quickly, much more lateral, much more entrepreneurial. And so I'm really trying to think about how do you build a movement around doing that? Because that old bureaucratic model is kind of protected by confederacy that includes business schools, consulting companies, regulators, and so on. And I think there's quite a few players that would have to come together and take this all seriously if we're going to make a big difference. But the case for doing so, I think, is now unimpeachable. The economic case in terms of trying to turn around that falling productivity growth, the social case in terms of upgrading every job around the world, the competitive case is clearly there, and the case for building organizations that are capable of solving the new challenges we have as a species. So I'm not sure that the impact I could have there is best done through a book. Maybe there's some other ways of bringing people together and getting us all focused on collaborating and working on that problem.
Gary, we're with you on that. Thank you, as always, for your time and insights. For anybody watching, I would start with Humanocracy and work backwards. Is my top tip. Really appreciate the time, Gary, and carry on.
It's a great pleasure, Stuart, and thank you for all that you have done at Thinkers50 to help people understand, that management is so important to us as human beings and to what we can accomplish, and just focusing that spotlight on that. And for anybody listening, Stuart and the Thinkers50 is a pretty reliable guide to where you may want to dig in if you want to kind of be at the bleeding edge yourself.
Thank you very much, Gary. As always, Gary's insights and perceptiveness, especially about the Thinkers50, is much appreciated and entirely accurate. Gary, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Be well.